So, I'm a speculative designer and researcher, and I stayed in a joystick factory. Okay, so before I go on, I really should spend some time explaining what I actually do and how this landed me in a joystick factory. So, I usually spend my time exploring fringe groups that are largely ignored by society. I've been creating what I call as platforms of engagement to nurture mutually beneficial relationships between the fringe and the mainstream. So instead of leaving them to become forgotten and left behind, I hope to guide industries as well as ourselves to see the richness and opportunities in the fringe. So although a lot of our opportunities is focused on the mainstream population, I've become fascinated with all those people that fall into the peripheries of our attention. I've become increasingly convinced that this is where all the really exciting stuff is coming from. Thanks. And this is something that the design world's known for a long time. In fact, we have a common research technique called extreme users, where researchers would observe non-mainstream users experiencing a particular product. For example, giving a 90-year-old a power tool or an iPad to a 3-year-old and seeing what unexpected behaviors would emerge. All this information and these insights, normally from the research, are then poured back to the original product to enhance them in some way for the mainstream. And this is interesting, or rather disconcerting if you think about it, as there are really two types of exploitation that are potentially happening here. One, we alter the original product for mainstream consumption, forgetting the outliers. It's sort of like stealing insights from them and then not caring about them at all. Or two, we take this learning, adapt our mainstream products to sell back to the fringes and essentially normalizing the fringe. And this has been really hot topic, with the design world recently asking itself if we're really helping or just exploiting through our work. With this in mind, I started exploring different projects, venturing into the weird and wonderful world of the fringe and creating surprising services with cat ladies that provide parasitic infection in spa therapies, giving opportunities for conspiracy theorists to exchange their ideas with the general public while providing a functional service of water filtration, persuading airport activists to give free historical village tours to stranded passengers, and organising the future of sex education workshops in Beijing love hotels. So traditionally, designers are responsible for innovative solutions to optimize consumption and manufacturing efficiency. My work is really about finding alternatives, relationships that can nurture functional and sustainable communities being designed out by technology. Zooming into September last year, I found myself in a Chinese joystick factory. Factories that make input devices specially designed for computer games. I thought with all these current studies of the gaming community, there really isn't anything about the making world, of this community. So let's watch a clip from the research. A joystick, like many other pieces of technology, involves a huge amount of design. A typical joystick factory such as this one in the suburbs of Shenzhen produces them. There are a lot more stories hiding behind the walls of this factory than our Western stereotypes of unsafe conditions and financial exploitation. Considering that there are more than 230 million Chinese factory workers, which is about 3/4 of the entire US population, we really ought to know much more about them. To address this, in summer 2011, I came to the city of Shenzhen, the largest manufacturing base in China. I spent time finding out who these factory workers are, how they live, where they sleep, what they eat, and ultimately, why this is important. These joystick makers are migrant workers, which means that they used to be farmers who'd left their lands behind. They could teach us how to grow corn just as well as assemble a joystick. We tend to be conscious of Chinese factory workers in terms of a working mass. We often hear about the impressive scale rather than relate to them on a human level. When the media discuss about factory salaries, they're really talking about these people in terms of economic value. And from my work with the fringe, I noticed that focusing on sensationalist extremes really isolates us from them, and they make us it makes it difficult for us to relate to them on a human scale. So I plunged myself into their mundane events, slept in their dorms, ate in their canteens, and watched soap with them. During the day, the workers gathered their chopsticks to eat together in the factory canteen. The factory I visited had a Citroën chef who'd often received complaints for adding too many spices. And the girls would protest about its impact on their skin conditions by picking out mountains of chopped chilies from their dishes and piling them directly onto the table. In the evenings, most of the young workers would hang out near the cheap eateries just outside the factories. The snack streets around the factories come to life at night, with each noodle maker, hot seller, pharmacist, herbalists pushing their own televisions out into the streets and screening individual channels. Different crowds would gather outside these venues according to viewer preferences, and during the commercial breaks every 12 minutes, these clusters would disperse as people get on with their usual businesses, only to reunite to continue with their favourite soaps. At night, the workers would return to sleep in the unisex factory dorms, within the only invisible privacy of the mosquito nets. Many of these spaces were decorated by spider plants growing in plastic bottles, snuck in by a nostalgic gardener. In the next clip, we'll go through some of the issues that led to my proposal of farmification.
A more pressing problem for this joystick factory community, however, is that people don't really buy joysticks anymore. The era of iPhones, iPads, and joystickless games like Kinect sees the end of the peripheral market. These factories are facing difficult decisions, and the workers who'd invested time and energy building relationships will lose their jobs, the roof over their heads, as well as their friends. I began to think about how these communities are created by our Western technological demands, and how design might be used to help these communities remain meaningful when our demands change. And the food question cropped back again. If there are 230 million migrant workers, this means that there are 200 million less farmers. Again, who's making all the food? Back in the joystick factory, I presented to the bosses the dangers in concentrating all the workforce only in manufacturing, and also the alienation of the workers from their countryside origins. I proposed to the bosses that workers be allowed to do part-time farming. The managers liked the idea of a financial buffer in times of difficulty using the lands just down the road. Other factories also became interested and began asking questions. In fact, we even had offers to sell the produces of the part-time farm back to the eateries in the snack street. You could call it a kind of farmification of the manufacturing process. In my month's research here at the joystick factory in Shenzhen, I had the privilege of getting to know the workers and respect their codependence on their community. My observations have resulted in a part-time farming scheme that would allow the migrant workers to gain control over their future lives in relation to their past values. And I've also become aware of the threat to this community each time our eyes glint on the latest tech fad.
So we've come here to encourage and embrace amazing newness, and it's often so easy to ignore the very groups that can provide the real opportunities for radical changes. We've had a brief exploration of the theory that ties my fringe work together and journeyed with factory workers who have been left behind from the demand for the very products that they manufacture, and finally see my proposal of a part-time farming scheme called Farmification to protect communities at the end of an innovation cycle. I'd like to end with the thought that radical newness isn't necessarily a yes or no to the common desires of new technologies, new toys and new businesses, but rather a more curious perspective to the broader systems that's implicated in our latest fads. Thank you.